He shoved me once, but he didn't get the chance to do it again. If you ever had someone who turned your kindness into their weapon, this story is for you. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Tale Hub, where every story pulls you in and never lets you go. He shoved me once, but he never got the chance to do it again. That single act, a push hard enough to make my body collide with cold metal, split my life into two clean halves, before it happened and after. It wasn't just the pain. It wasn't even the laughter that followed. It was the silence inside me that screamed louder than everything else. People think cruelty begins with words. But no, it begins with permission. The kind we quietly give to others. The kind we pretend not to notice. My name doesn't matter here, but you'll know me by the way I remember. I grew up next to Blake Henderson, the golden boy, the son of my parents' closest friends, and the storm I never learned to predict. From the moment we could walk, we were side by side. Backyard sprinklers, scraped knees, popsicles melting in the sun. Our parents thought it was adorable. Their children, inseparable, future best friends forever. And for a while, it was almost true. Blake could be kind. When we were 5, he gave me his favorite blue crayon because mine broke. When we were 8, he defended me from a boy who called me names on the playground. But that same afternoon, he laughed at me when I tripped. That was Blake. Kindness one heartbeat, cruelty the next. I didn't understand it then. I only knew that when he smiled at me, the world felt like summer. And when he sneered, it felt like winter wouldn't end. By middle school, our paths started to drift. He found friends who liked chaos, boys who shouted and pushed, who measured power by how many people they could make flinch. I stayed in my quieter world, books, sketchpads, and long walks home alone. Yet every weekend, our families still met for dinners, still smiled for pictures, as if nothing between us had changed. But everything had. Then came the summer before high school. Blake left for football camp, a month away, nothing unusual. When he came back, I almost didn't recognize him. The boy who left with knobby knees and 2 long arms returned with muscle, height, and a new kind of confidence that carried its own gravity. His laughter changed. It wasn't the giggle of a kid anymore. It was deeper, deliberate, like he knew people listened differently now. Everyone noticed. The girls especially. And I noticed too, but not just the way they did. Something fluttered in me when he passed. I told myself it was nostalgia, a remnant of childhood affection. But I knew better. It was a crush, uninvited and entirely inconvenient. Blake became the center of every room he entered. He moved through the halls like he owned them, his new teammates orbiting around him. Teachers praised his discipline, classmates cheered at his games, and whispers followed wherever he went. What didn't change was the way he treated me, at least not in any predictable way. Some days he'd act like the old Blake, offering to carry my books or telling the mean girls to leave me alone. Other days, he joined them, laughing at jokes made at my expense, pretending not to know me. I told myself it was just teenage confusion. But the truth was darker. He needed to be cruel when others watched, because kindness, to him, looked like weakness. By sophomore year, I became his favorite contradiction, the person he'd defend in private and humiliate in public. My emotions started to feel like an illness, shame mixed with longing, anger tangled with affection. I learned to survive by shrinking myself. I avoided the hall where he and his friends gathered. I ate lunch in the art room. I built a version of myself that could disappear. Yet, every so often, he'd appear beside me, helping me pick up dropped books, asking if I was okay, his voice low and soft. And just like that, I'd forgive him in my heart. I'd let myself hope, but hope can be crueler than hate. Senior year arrived. The air was charged with that strange mix of anticipation and nostalgia, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to end and begin at once. I told myself that maybe Blake would change. Maybe he'd grow out of his arrogance. I was wrong. His words got sharper, his laughter colder, and the girls who worshipped him followed his lead. Shoulder checks in the hallway became normal. Snickers behind my back turned into open taunts. Still, I said nothing. My silence was my armor. Until one night, everything cracked. It was late, nearly midnight. I was studying in my room when a soft knock sounded on the window. I pulled back the curtain, startled. Blake stood there, half drunk, eyes glassy but wet. I hesitated, but he whispered my name. Not like a taunt, but a plea. Against my better judgment, I let him in. He sat on the edge of my bed, head in his hands, words spilling like a confession. He said he was sorry, for everything. For the names, the laughter, the way he treated me like a game. He said he didn't know why he did it, that sometimes he hated himself for it. He admitted things I never expected to hear. That despite his popularity, he felt ugly, weak. that he changed clothes in the bathroom stall because he couldn't bear the way others looked at him, that he'd never told anyone because it made him feel less than the image he'd built. For the first time in years, I saw the boy from our childhood, the one who used to share crayons and secrets. Something inside me softened. I forgave him. He hugged me before he left, and for the first time in forever, I believed maybe things could get better. But the next morning, everything burned. When I reached my locker, he was already there, surrounded by his football friends and the group of cheerleaders who orbited him like planets. He was laughing with them, the way he always did. When his eyes met mine, there was a flicker. Recognition, guilt, something human. But then his expression hardened, and he stepped closer. He didn't say a word. He just shoved me. The metal of the lockers bit into my back. Pain seared through me, sharp and hot. My books scattered across the floor. Laughter erupted, cruel, hysterical, unstoppable. I looked at him, searching for the boy from last night. He was gone. There was only the golden god, grinning down at the wreckage he'd made. "Why?" I whispered, though my voice barely carried. He shrugged. That same indifferent gesture I'd seen 100 times. Then he walked away, arm sliding around the waist of a girl who laughed too loudly. I stood there, surrounded by witnesses who did nothing. Blood trickled down my back, hidden under my sweater. Tears blurred the floor. For the rest of the day, I felt invisible again, but this time, not because I hid, because nobody wanted to see. At home, my parents noticed the marks. They noticed the way I couldn't lift my arm without wincing. They asked questions I didn't want to answer, but truth has a way of escaping. When I finally told them, they were furious, ready to march to his house and demand justice. But I stopped them. For the first time in months, I smiled. Not kindly, but sharply. "I've got this," I said. They didn't understand. But they didn't need to. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted. Something that had been dormant too long. The silence that had protected me turned into something else. Resolve. If Blake wanted to turn me into a joke, I would give him a spectacle he'd never forget. That night, I planned everything. Years of knowing him, his habits, his insecurities, the combination to his locker, became my ammunition. It wasn't rage that fueled me, not really. It was clarity. A quiet, surgical precision. Revenge wouldn't fix the pain, but it would balance it. The night after the shove, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it replay. The look in his eyes, the laughter of the hallway, the sting of metal against my back. I thought about how my body hit the lockers, and the way no one reached out to help. Even now, when I blinked, the sound echoed. That hollow metallic thud that told me I was small and unworthy in their world. For hours, I sat on my bedroom floor, my back against the wall, the dim light from my lamp painting long shadows across the carpet. The silence of the house felt foreign, almost mocking. It was hard to reconcile how the same world could hold both safety and cruelty. That night wasn't about pain. It was about realization. A sudden, cruel clarity that no one would save me but me. My parents had fallen asleep after hours of arguing about whether to call the school, to report what happened, to confront Blake's parents. But I couldn't let them. I couldn't let anyone else touch this story, because it wasn't just about what Blake did. It was about what he made me become. I didn't want pity. I wanted power. The next morning, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. There were faint bruises under my eyes from lack of sleep. My back ached when I moved. But something else had changed. Something in the way my eyes didn't flinch when I met their reflection. There was no trace of the girl who used to shrink in the hallways. That girl was gone. In her place stood someone I didn't quite recognize yet. Someone colder, sharper, quieter. A version of me born from humiliation, wearing silence like armor. At school, whispers filled the corridors. Everyone knew, they always did. But the story they told wasn't the truth. According to them, I had overreacted. I had slipped. I had exaggerated. Blake had just bumped into me. He hadn't meant it. The usual rewriting of cruelty into something digestible for everyone else's comfort. I walked past them all, my head high, pretending I didn't care, pretending the laughter didn't crawl beneath my skin. When I reached my locker, I saw it. The dent from where my body had hit. Small, barely visible. But to me, it was permanent. I ran my fingers over it. Cold, smooth, unforgiving. And that was the moment the plan began forming. Not out of rage, but out of logic. If Blake wanted a show, I would give him one. I began studying him. Not the version he showed the world, the confident, charming football player who never seemed to sweat. No, I studied the version beneath the surface. The habits, the fears, the inconsistencies. He always showered last after practice. He always carried his gym bag close, never letting anyone touch it. He avoided undressing in front of others, even his teammates. That insecurity he had confessed to me, it was real, and he was terrified someone would find out. I realized then, people like Blake build their kingdoms on fear. Take away that fear, and they crumble. Days passed. I became quieter, more deliberate. He must have noticed the shift, the way I didn't flinch anymore, the way I looked at him without the usual sadness. But he didn't know what to make of it, because silence unnerved him. He was used to control, to reactions. The flinch, the tears, the apology that made him feel powerful again. But I gave him nothing. I became the calm before a storm he couldn't predict. It was Friday when everything aligned. The school gym buzzed with noise, sneakers squeaking against the floor, whistles blowing, the smell of sweat and adrenaline filling the air. I knew his schedule. During third period, he'd be in the locker room for gym class. That was when I made my move. The hallway outside the locker rooms was empty. I waited until the coast was clear, then slipped inside the boys' section, the scent of deodorant and damp towels instantly thick in the air. I found his locker easily. The combination, his birthday, hadn't changed since middle school. Some things never do. Inside were his clothes, wallet, phone, everything he'd need after class. I hesitated for just a second. Was I really doing this? Then I remembered the shove, the laughter, the way he walked away like I was nothing. And the hesitation vanished. I grabbed everything, every piece of clothing, every item that tethered him to comfort, and stuffed it all into my backpack. The metal door clanged shut behind me, sealing my decision. For a moment, standing there in the echoing quiet, I felt the strangest mix of fear and exhilaration. This was my rebellion, quiet but precise. I hid in the girls' restroom, waiting. Minutes stretched like hours. My heart beat fast but steady. I knew his habits too well. He'd wait until everyone was gone before showering, desperate for privacy. When I finally heard the noise of the gym fade, the shouting replaced by silence, I returned. The locker room was empty, except for the faint sound of running water. His gym clothes lay folded neatly on the bench, a towel hanging near the shower door. Without hesitation, I grabbed them too. Every movement felt like reclaiming a part of myself, each piece of fabric a fragment of my stolen dignity. Then I slipped out, fast and silent, before anyone could see me. I waited in the hallway just outside, hiding behind the trophy case. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I heard it, the sharp, angry shout of realization, the sound of the shower curtain being yanked back, the thud of footsteps. He stepped out, dripping water, panic clear in his voice. "Where are my clothes?" Even from a distance, I could imagine the fear clawing at his chest. Then the door burst open. There he was, Blake Henderson, the untouchable golden boy, standing in the doorway with nothing but a towel around his waist. His eyes found me instantly. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then his face turned white. He knew. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I just smiled, slow, deliberate, like someone who had already won. Then I turned and ran. The halls echoed with my footsteps and his behind me. He shouted my name, panic sharpening every syllable. Students poured out of classrooms, drawn by the noise. They saw him, the perfect Blake, chasing after me, half-dressed, his face red with humiliation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some laughed, some filmed, and I kept running. It wasn't just revenge. It was a release. Every step was a strike against the version of myself he'd built, the one who cowered and cried. Now he was the one exposed, vulnerable, afraid. When the principal stepped out of his office, it was over. Teachers pulled us apart. The crowd scattered like startled birds. I was suspended for a week. Blake got detention, though we both knew my punishment was heavier. But I didn't care, because for the first time, I wasn't a victim. For the first time, I made him feel what I had felt. At home, my parents didn't know what to say. They were disappointed, angry, confused. They didn't understand why I'd risk everything for a moment of childish revenge. But I wasn't sorry. I told them it was worth it. Every second. What I didn't tell them was how powerful it felt, not because I hurt him, but because I finally refused to be silent. The next week, I walked through the halls again. People stared. Some with awe, some with disgust, others with newfound respect. Whispers followed me, but they sounded different now. I was no longer the quiet girl. I was the girl who made Blake Henderson, the football star, the golden boy, run through school half-naked, begging for mercy. The same people who once mocked me now moved out of my way. And Blake. He avoided my eyes. Completely. He didn't shove me again. He didn't speak to me at all. But sometimes, when we passed each other in the hall, I caught a flicker in his expression. Guilt, maybe shame. I couldn't tell. It didn't matter, because the power balance had shifted, and I wasn't planning to give it back. Still, at night, when I closed my eyes, the feeling of victory felt hollow. I had proven a point, but at what cost? I had become something sharp, something that cut both ways. And while Blake's pride bled, so did my innocence. But I wasn't done yet, because the shove, the laughter, the pain, none of it could be erased. And part of me still needed to know why. Why he had chosen me. Why he had tried to destroy someone who had once been his closest friend. I didn't know it yet, but finding that answer would take me somewhere I didn't expect, into the darkest parts of his life, and my own. The week of my suspension felt strangely quiet. No alarms, no crowded hallways, no laughter echoing down tiled walls. Just me, alone with the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, the kind that demands reflection. At first, I replayed it all with pride. The look on his face, the gasps, the whispers. For days, I lived on that adrenaline, telling myself I'd done something brave, that I'd finally evened the score. But when the adrenaline faded, all that was left was noise. Not from outside, from inside. A restless, gnawing thought that whispered, was this really victory? My parents barely spoke to me. They wanted to understand, but I couldn't explain. How could I make them see that the act wasn't just revenge? It was survival? I hadn't ruined Blake for the thrill. I'd done it because it was the only way I could stop feeling like prey. But when the laughter died down, I started wondering if maybe I had become what I hated. Someone who used humiliation as a weapon. It was a thought I pushed away, but it lingered like smoke in a room with no windows. When I returned to school, the air was different. Students still whispered, but now there was hesitation in their tone, a strange mix of admiration and fear. Some smiled at me as I walked by, as if we shared an inside joke. Others avoided my gaze entirely. And Blake. He was quieter than I'd ever seen him. No crowd around him, no jokes, no noise, just silence. He kept to himself, showing up to class, leaving early. His shoulders seemed lower, as if something had pressed down on him. For a moment, I felt satisfaction. But only for a moment. Because then I realized what I'd done. I had taken away the one thing he'd built his whole identity around. Control. Rumors began to twist in new directions. Some said he'd been suspended too. Others whispered he'd quit the team. A few claimed he'd been seen crying in the parking lot. High school gossip, cruel, exaggerated, relentless. But the truth was simpler. He was unraveling. And I couldn't tell if that made me feel triumphant or sick. A few days later, I found something unexpected. A note. It was slipped through the vents of my locker, folded into a small square. The handwriting was unmistakable. Neat, deliberate, familiar. I deserved it. But please don't tell anyone what I told you that night. No signature. None needed. I stared at the paper for a long time, my hands trembling slightly. He was talking about that night. The confession. The insecurity. The truth he'd shared when he was drunk and vulnerable. I remembered every word, the rawness in his voice, the way he had looked almost human. And I realized then that I held something far more powerful than revenge. His secret. I could destroy him completely if I wanted. All I had to do was tell people the truth. For a few days, the temptation burned inside me. He had made me bleed, made me cry, made me believe I was worthless. Why should I protect him? But every time I pictured exposing him, something stopped me. Not morality, not fear. Something more complicated. Because if I did that, I'd be him. The version of him that used my vulnerability as ammunition. And that was a line I wasn't willing to cross. Still, I wanted answers. Why had he done it? Why confess something so fragile only to betray me the next day? So, I decided to confront him. Not publicly, not with noise, but quietly. After class one afternoon, I followed him to the back field where he sometimes sat alone. The field was empty, except for the rustle of wind through dry grass. He saw me coming and stiffened. His jaw tightened, like he was bracing for another blow. I stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, without looking at me, "Are you here to finish what you started?" His voice was rough, but there was no anger in it, just exhaustion. I could have said 100 things, all the sharp, cruel words I'd rehearsed in my head, but none of them fit. Instead, I said quietly, "Why?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He sighed and stared at the horizon, his expression unreadable. "When I told you that stuff," he said slowly, "I meant it, every word. But when I saw you the next morning, I panicked. My friends were there, they were watching, and I knew if I didn't." He trailed off. Didn't what? I asked. Didn't prove I was still in control. There it was. The truth, simple and ugly. Control. That was all he'd ever chased. The thing he clung to when everything else felt fragile. I didn't want them to think I was weak, he said quietly. So I turned on you. Again. He didn't look at me when he said it. And for the first time, I saw something real in him. Not arrogance, not cruelty. Just a scared boy trying to hold himself together inside a cage he built. We stood there in silence for a long time. The wind carried the smell of grass and distant rain. I wanted to hate him. Truly, deeply hate him. But I couldn't. Because I finally understood what he was. Not a monster, but a mirror. The version of me that could have existed if I had let anger consume me completely. That realization didn't erase what he did. It didn't make forgiveness easy. But it cracked something open. A small door I didn't even know I'd closed. Before I left, I took the folded note from my pocket and held it out. You don't have to worry, I said softly. Your secret is safe. He looked at me, eyes wide with surprise, then nodded slowly. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something close to peace. After that day, we didn't speak again. Not for the rest of the year. Blake stopped trying to reclaim his old life. He quit football, spent his lunches in the library, and started tutoring younger students. The people who once worshipped him moved on to new idols, leaving him behind. And me. I found something new too. A strange sense of calm that came from letting go of the need to win. The dent in the locker remained, small and permanent, like a scar on metal. But I didn't touch it anymore. Because I didn't need to. Graduation came and went. Caps in the air, photographs, laughter that felt both real and rehearsed. When they called Blake's name, the applause was polite but distant. When they called mine, it was quiet, but it felt honest. After the ceremony, as everyone scattered for pictures, he approached me one last time. He didn't say anything, just handed me an envelope. Inside was a note, short, simple, written in the same careful handwriting as before. I'm leaving for college early. I don't expect forgiveness, but thank you for not becoming like me. I stood there, reading those words over and over until the paper softened at the edges. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't closure, but it was something. An acknowledgement that maybe we both had learned something from the wreckage we created. Years passed, and for a long time, I didn't think about him. Until one afternoon, in the city where I'd built a new life, I saw him again. It was by chance. A crowded coffee shop, a glance across the room. He looked different. Older, softer. The kind of softness that comes from time and work. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, he smiled. Small, uncertain. I nodded back. And in that small, silent exchange, I felt something shift inside me again. Not anger, not regret, just release. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making them hurt. It's learning to live well while they're still trying to figure out how to start. That night, I walked home under a bruised purple sky, the city glowing around me. The past felt far away, but still a part of me, like an old scar that no longer aches but never disappears. And I realized something simple. The story wasn't about him anymore. It was about the girl who was shoved once, and never let it happen again. The years after high school felt like shedding an old skin. College was supposed to be a fresh start, new city, new faces, no past. But the thing about running from your story is that it always learns how to follow you. For the first few months, I kept my head down, the way I used to back then. I told myself I was just being cautious, but deep down, I knew I was still waiting for the next Blake to appear. Someone to test my boundaries, to see if I'd still flinch. But no one did. And that silence forced me to face something harder than cruelty. Myself. In class, I studied psychology, partly because I wanted to understand people, but mostly because I wanted to understand him. What makes someone so afraid of weakness that they destroy others to hide their own? It started as an academic curiosity, but slowly it became personal healing. I realized that people who hurt others aren't always born cruel. Some are just terrified of being seen. That realization didn't excuse Blake, but it helped me understand why forgiveness mattered. Not for him, but for me. Because hatred was a chain, and I'd been carrying it long after I stopped being a victim. One evening, in my second year of college, I found myself walking near the river that cut through the campus. The air was cold, and the sky shimmered with the last light of sunset. I stopped at the railing and watched the water move, slow, relentless, uncaring. And out of nowhere, I thought of that locker. The dent, the blood, the laughter. It used to burn in my chest like acid. But now, the memory felt quiet. like a story I had read a long time ago, one that no longer belonged to me. Maybe that was healing, not forgetting, but remembering without the pain. That night, I started writing again. It wasn't a diary or a confession. It was a story, mine, disguised in fiction. The characters were different, the setting too, but the heartbeat of it was the same. A girl who was shoved once and decided she'd never be pushed again. A boy who wore cruelty like armor because he was afraid of being seen. And the fragile, aching space between them, where love, pain, and guilt all bled together. I didn't write it for anyone, but the words came easily, like they had been waiting for years to be freed. By graduation, that story had become something more. A professor encouraged me to publish it in the university's literary journal. I hesitated, not because it was too personal, but because it felt like closing a chapter. And when it finally appeared in print, I realized that it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation, taking back the story that had once defined me, and reshaping it into something powerful. A few months later, I received an email. It was short, simple. I read your story. I knew it was about me. Thank you for letting me be the villain. It was signed, Blake. I stared at the message for a long time. He had found it, read it, understood it. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. We had both told our truths. His apology was in that single sentence. Mine was in the fact that I didn't need to answer. Time passed, seasons changed, life moved on. I built a career around storytelling, the kind that explored the things people don't talk about: guilt, fear, forgiveness. My words reached people who had been hurt, people who had hurt others, people searching for themselves between both extremes. And sometimes, when I stood on stage reading from my work, I could feel it, the collective silence of strangers connecting through shared pain. It was in those moments that I realized the pain wasn't my enemy. It was my origin. Without it, I wouldn't have learned empathy. Without it, I wouldn't have found my voice. Without it, I wouldn't have learned how to see the humanity in broken people, even in those who once broke me. Years later, when I visited my hometown again, everything looked smaller. The school, the streets, even the houses. Like the world had shrunk, or maybe I had just grown beyond it. I walked the hallways one last time. They were empty now, the lockers silent and cold. I found mine, and there it was. The dent. Still there, faint but visible. I ran my fingers over it, not with anger this time, but with gratitude. That dent had once marked my lowest moment. Now it was proof of how far I'd come. Outside, the sky was painted in shades of gold and violet. I stood there for a while, listening to the sound of distant laughter from the new students, the kind of laughter that's pure, untouched by cruelty. And I smiled, because somewhere out there, another girl was learning what I once had to learn, that pain doesn't define you, how you rise from it does. That night, back in my hotel room, I opened my laptop and began writing again. Not about revenge, not about pain, about healing. The kind that comes slowly, quietly, like sunlight creeping into a room after a long night. I titled the new story, He Shoved Me Once. Siad, and as the words filled the page, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Because the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been hurt and still chose to keep their heart open. The next morning, before leaving town, I visited the old coffee shop downtown. And there he was again. Blake. Older. Different. Maybe even happy. He looked up, met my eyes, and nodded once. Not in apology, not in guilt, but in acknowledgement. A quiet understanding between two people who had shared a painful story and finally learned how to let it go. I smiled back. Then I walked away. As the car pulled out of town, I whispered to myself, not as a curse, but as a blessing. He shoved me once, but he didn't get the chance to do it again. Because that was the truth. Not about violence or revenge, but about growth. About becoming someone who doesn't need to fight to prove her worth. Someone who simply knows it. Every story has an ending, but not every ending brings peace. Subscribe to Tale Hub, where stories linger in your heart long after the last word. Years had passed since that day in the hallway. The dents in lockers, the laughter, the bruises, all remained as faint echoes in the corners of memory. But they no longer hurt. Not because they were erased, but because they had been transformed. I had grown into someone who could carry the weight of the past without letting it define me. Every scar, every tear, every moment of fear had become a step on the path to understanding, of myself, of others, and of the fragile complexity of human hearts. It was autumn when I returned to my hometown for a brief visit. The leaves were gold and crimson, falling softly on quiet streets. The air was crisp, carrying with it the sense of late harvests and distant rain. Everything felt smaller, not diminished, but familiar in the way only the past can be. I walked the halls of my old high school one last time. The echoes of footsteps on linoleum were ghostly. The lockers stood like silent sentinels, holding the secrets of countless students, including mine. At my locker, I paused. There it was. The dent. Faded now, yet permanent. I ran my fingers over it gently, not with anger, not with regret, but with gratitude. It had been a marker, yes, of cruelty endured, but also of resilience discovered. I didn't expect to see him. Yet, in the quiet corridor, Blake Henderson appeared. Older, calmer, a man whose shoulders no longer carried the weight of teenage pride and fear. His hair was shorter, his smile softer. He looked up and met my gaze, not with the arrogance of youth, but with the humility of experience. For a moment, time paused. We didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. A nod, slight but meaningful, bridged years of pain, misunderstanding, and silent growth. In that gesture, I felt the final thread of our tangled history loosen. Later that evening, I sat in the empty coffee shop where I had once received his note. The light of dusk fell across the table, casting warm shadows. I reflected on the journey, the shove, the tears, the plan, the revenge, the aftermath. Every moment had shaped me. Every heartbreak had taught me patience, strength, and empathy. I realized something important. True redemption does not always require confrontation. It does not demand apologies or explanations. Sometimes it simply requires acknowledgement, a recognition that we have survived, learned, and grown beyond what hurt us. And in that quiet space, I felt peace. The stories I had written over the years, the ones that drew from my experiences, had become more than just words on a page. They were vessels for those who had felt invisible, powerless, or afraid. Readers reached out, sharing their own tales of pain and triumph. They wrote about feeling small in a world that overlooked them, about discovering courage where they least expected it. And through their voices, I realized the ultimate lesson. Our experiences, even the cruelest ones, can become gifts if we allow them to teach rather than imprison us. One night, I returned to the river that flowed through my college town. The water moved steadily, indifferent to the passing of time, yet carrying the reflection of countless sunsets. I thought of the girl who had been shoved, the girl who had fought, the girl who had discovered that strength is not always loud and power is not always visible. I whispered softly into the evening air, a benediction more than a declaration. He shoved me once, but I never let it happen again, and I never will. It was not vengeance, not triumph, not even pride. It was quiet redemption. Years later, when I sat down to tell this story for TaleHub, I realized the truth. The story wasn't just about Blake. It wasn't even just about me. It was about all of us. About the times we are hurt, the times we falter, the times we feel powerless. And about the power of choosing, finally, not to be defined by those moments. To step into life fully, without fear. To forgive, not necessarily for them, but for ourselves. The story ends here. Not with fireworks, not with vengeance, not with applause, but with the soft, steady pulse of life moving forward. Because in the end, the strongest revenge, the truest redemption, is living well, living fully, living freely. Thank you for listening to this TaleHub story. If you felt every moment, every heartbeat, and every lesson, don't forget to subscribe to TaleHub for more stories that stay with you. We appreciate your time and support.